Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the fine people at where, Antony? Polyhymnia.
Khaki. Polyhymnia. Polyhymnia.
Go look it up. Everybody who's saying, what the hell is that? Go look it up.
So before we had the letters CACI. Now what are we, just P?
Shut up. What's new and exciting in your world? You know, Ant, there's a doxology here, and you're getting in the way of it. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
See, you ask these questions, I'm just not prepared to answer.
How are you not prepared? I've asked it every single week.
I forget.
Every single week, for as far back as I can remember, I have said the same thing to you, and every single week you have found a way to disappoint me.
Well, I'm looking through my notes here. Something struck me as interesting the other day. President Trump's in the news doing all these things that he's doing, and judges are telling him to stop deporting people, and he's saying, basically, I can do what I want. And people are getting annoyed, disturbed, some are cheering him on, whatever it is, but there's this great sense of something is wrong because the president is disobeying the judges. And it occurred to me as I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about people getting all bent out of shape about it, and suddenly it dawned on me, but no, this is what the founders intended. I mean, what we've been doing is splitting power between the parties, the Democrats versus the Republicans. That's not the way the government was set up. It was set up to split power amongst the branches.
And the states as well.
And the states, right. I mean, that's another issue entirely.
So, the power is chopped up vertically and horizontally. The interesting thing right now is all the people who were so happy about how the courts interrupted Joe Biden's plans for the last 4 years now are saying things like, we didn't elect a judiciary. Well,
oh, right.
No kidding. I am getting so irked with political hypocrisy that I think that should be our next big project, is on political hypocrisy.
And that's what fascinates me, that there's a lot more of it than what I thought. I mean, I always thought the people in the extremes will do whatever their party says.
It's everybody.
But where it comes out here, in Northern Virginia, which is a very blue area, tons of Teslas around. Now, 9 months ago, a Tesla was a sign that you were a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat.
You were a good liberal.
Right, yeah, and so the Republicans are keying the Teslas, and now it's the other way around, right? Which just tells me that people aren't thinking. They're picking whoever their standard bearer is, and whatever the standard bearer says, that's what we're going to do.
There are things that Donald Trump says on the regular that all of his followers were so pissed off about over the last 4 years that I don't even know how they don't see it. Apparently they don't. If people are out there getting a little worked up about the things I have said, which seems to happen quite a lot, given the hate mail that I've been getting, and we'll get to that in a second. If you're all worked up about it, you should go look at Federalist 9, because not Federalist 10, but Federalist 9 gets into why each branch should have partial agency into the operations of the other two.
They're designed to meddle in each other's affairs.
That is the design. So did you elect a judiciary? Well, not exactly, but it's part of the system that you bought into. So keep quiet and deal with it. I mean, just stop your whining. But I did get some hate mail recently about a criticism I made. Apparently, I didn't mean it this way, but apparently someone took it this way, that I was criticizing the Mennonites in Texas because they're the ones who are apparently avoiding the measles vaccination, and theirs are the children who are dying. And I did just a little bit of digging on this because I thought, do they actually have a religious objection? And it turns out that they actually don't. You can be Mennonite and take a vaccination. It's fine. They tend to have trouble cutting any slack at all to government authority. So that's going to cause an obvious issue. But it's not doctrinal. They can have this if they want. So if you're sending me hate mail about that, dial it down a notch.
You were in Utah with the Mormons for a long while. Did the Mormons have a problem with vaccination?
Not to my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there were some there who did. And one of the gigantic cause celeb when I was there was that they were finally getting around to putting fluoride in the water in Utah. And this was back in 99, 2000 when I lived there the first time. And my students would come to class talking about the satanic problem of fluoride in the water.
Yeah.
And, it's always this kind of nonsense. I mean, believe it if you want. It doesn't make it any more true.
We're all, and I do mean all, we are all, to a greater or lesser degree, terrified of change.
I'm really not. I mean, I have a conservative soul. I'll admit it. I would prefer if things didn't change all the time, but I'm not really frightened of it.
I can barely get you to get out of bed an hour earlier or later.
Well, that's because I have the sleep condition, you idiot. I can't get out of bed any earlier. All right, see, now I'm angry. And I'm just going to tell you to be quiet because I want to talk about Pete Hegseth, our dyed-in-the-wool loser of a defense secretary, who a few weeks back, you might recall, published a bunch of secure information to a group chat that he was using.
Right. Yes.
You remember this? Turns out he did it another time too.
A time before or since?
That's a good question. It seemed to be right around the same time, but it's another group of people on Signal about strikes that we made in Yemen. And, I mean, his brother was on the list this time. These are people who have no business knowing what our military plans in Yemen are. There were a number of people on the list. I predicted when that first list came out that Pete Hegseth would crash and burn in some sort of alcohol-fueled ordeal. And now I'm really, really predicting it. Any other Secretary of Defense in any other administration would have been fired after the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're going to plan on keeping him around for the second one, but by any rational standard, he should be out of a job.
Well, see, and this goes back to what you were talking about earlier. When Hillary was caught with her server and classified emails on it, the people on the right, and rightly so, lost their minds. This was a security breach. There were laws against it. But now the shoe's on the other foot. Are those same people losing their minds or no? That's no big deal.
No big deal. And when you impress upon them that, no, indeed it is a big deal, what do they say? Well, Hillary Clinton, blah, 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 blah. Not realizing that if you want to have standards, everybody has to live up to them.
Right. Yes. And let me underline here for people that are firing up their fingers for the hate mail. This is not an anti-Trump tirade we're going on here. This is a question of consistency. You hold somebody to a standard, you hold both sides to that standard.
Yeah, and on that cheerful note, we might as well move on to the foolishness of the week.
I was just getting fired up.
Yeah, well, you're about to get even more fired up because for the foolishness of the week, we go back again to that moron is the only word I can use, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who declared upon hearing that Pope Francis had just passed away, evil is being defeated by the hand of God.
Oh, my.
In a celebration,
Too soon, Marjorie.
In a celebration of Pope Francis's death.
Yeah.
Classless, miserable woman. She needs to go as far away as is humanly possible. I can't believe the people of her district in Georgia keep sending her to Congress. It should be embarrassing to them. But of course, they have no shame. So nothing's going to ever be embarrassing to them.
We should take this moment, because, of course, the news just came out today of his death, and you and I have taken him to task repeatedly in newspaper articles, here on the podcast, whenever he stepped his foot into economics. Having said all of that, as horrible of an economist as I think he was, in terms of being a church leader, I was very pleased with him. I thought he did a lot of good inside the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I really wasn't. I'm not a big fan. I can't think of many good things to say. But I will never dance on somebody's grave. Just stop it, for the love of God. Just stop it. It's utterly classless, and you shouldn't need a bald guy on a podcast to tell you that. You should know, before you open your stupid mouth, that it's going to be offensive.
James is getting fired up now.
Look, she's an idiot. And the fact that she just keeps on running her mouth and nobody tells her to shut up is astonishing to me.
Going back to the principle of consistency, and I'll make a prediction here. Amongst the arch-conservative Catholics, there were a number of groups who claimed that Francis was not a legitimate pope. And they had all kinds of arguments as to...
He is Satan's minion, Ant. Where have you been?
Well, but the fact is, they were pointing to arguments in the apostolic succession and how it did not trace to Francis, therefore Francis was not a legitimate pope. I'm not going to go into any of that. What I'm going to predict is, if the next pope who's elected is an arch-conservative, all of those arguments would still apply to him, and I guarantee you those same people will all of a sudden discover a flaw in their previous argument, which means that the next pope, who, assuming he's an arch-conservative, all of a sudden is legitimate. And this brings us back to this issue of, you apply a principle, you apply a rule, and it should apply to everybody, whether you like them or not.
Yeah, one would think, right?
And I had a friend who was this way. We would debate economics, and this person was not an economist, but enjoyed thinking about it. And so many of his arguments were lacking in principle, so that he would end up, like we're describing here, arguing, for example, in favor of markets when they produce the outcome that he wants, or against markets when they don't produce the outcome that he wants, ignoring the principle entirely. And I pointed out to him, look, at the end, what you really want is just to be dictator. You just want the outcome that you want, and to hell with everybody else. And he kind of nodded and said, yeah, I guess I do. Well, he was honest in that, I guess.
At least he was honest about it.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
This week, I want you to talk about it. I'm going to throw it out here. The philosopher John Rawls proposed a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. And you're going to have to correct me here because this is your area rather than mine. But as I understand it, the argument went like this. Suppose...
Let's stop before you go any further.
Okay, go ahead. You can do it better than I can.
It's two-step argument, and the first step is not the veil of ignorance. It's what he calls the original position.
Okay.
The original position for Rawls, and just to give you an idea, Rawls was born in 1921 and died in 2002. Right. So.
Oh, that recently, really?
Yeah. He had a very long career, but his most important work was in the 1980s. He wrote A Theory of Justice, a gigantic, very boring book from which these things are coming. It's one of those cases where he wrote a very big, influential book that would have been an outstanding article.
Right.
Right. Now I got to read like 900 pages of this because he just couldn't jam it all into an article. I mean, he did, actually. Mm-hmm. The original position and the veil of ignorance were released this way once upon a time. Now, with the original position, what he's getting at is a kind of state of nature theory, right? So when we think about Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and even Montesquieu, who in the Persian Letters has a kind of state of nature theory, when we think about all of them, what do we always think about when you think about the state of nature? It's a group of people living out in the wilderness without benefit of government. This is always what the state of nature is. And asking what kind of rights these people would have in that condition, what they would do, if anything, collectively in that condition, right? These are the important questions because they arrive at something that we might recognize as just. If you want a just society, these are probably the questions you're going to ask. And it's interesting, right? Because for Hobbes, life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, he says. Mm-hmm. It's just brutal. We will kill each other in the state of nature.
According to Hobbes, right.
Yeah, according to Hobbes, Locke comes along and says, well, why do you think that? Wouldn't we kind of just leave each other be for the most part? And Rousseau comes along and thinks, well, why would you think of that? Wouldn't it be the case that we had a certain amount of empathy if we saw somebody who looked just like ourselves suffering? Well, all these things are right? We might kill each other, but we probably wouldn't, and we would probably even feel sorry for one another if we saw our fellows suffering. Mm-hmm. And okay, you got three very different takes on a state of nature right there. They are mutually incompatible.
Right.
Just incompatible. And enter Rawls, who said, well, I think you're actually all taking this in the wrong direction. Really, what we need is this thing, the original position, where we can talk about people living without benefit of government. But, you could have a thought experiment and ask what that would be like. And more importantly, we have this thing, the veil of ignorance, right? And he says, in this original position, where we live without benefit of government, okay, let's ask a very basic question in a new and exciting way. And look, I'm not a big fan of John Rawls, but this is interesting. He says, what kind of life would you sign on for? What kind of overarching government would you be in favor of if you didn't know anything about details of your own life?
Okay, so imagine that you're about to be born, and here you are up in the cosmos seeing, and you get to choose to be born into circumstance A or circumstance B. That's what you're... Oh, no. No, he tells you you're going to be born into a society with this government.
Well, careful. Because the idea is that once you are behind the veil of ignorance, when you don't know anything about the details of your own life, the kind of government that you would be in favor of will be very, very different than one that you would choose with an understanding of the details of your own life. And that just seems exactly correct, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, because look, designing a society is always an exercise in the implementation of justice. But what you know about yourself will somehow influence how you will choose. So
okay, so let me make sure I got this straight.
Yeah.
So the thought experiment is you could be born, for example, into a rich household or a poor household. I'm not going to tell you which one you're going to be born into. You tell me what kind of government you want, and then we're going to roll the dice, and you're going to end up in one of these households.
That's right.
And now all of a sudden, those of us who are the staunchest defenders of keeping government out of our wallets, all of a sudden, a lot of those people are going to say, well, maybe there's a call for a welfare state.
That's right. Hang on a second. And it doesn't really get in front of us when we think about rich people and poor people. It's more pointed when we think, okay, I might be black, I might be white. I might be Asian. I might be Jewish. I don't know. I might be disabled. I might be fully abled. I don't know.
Right. Right.
The idea here is that if these are the sorts of things you don't know, you're going to do whatever you can to take care of, if not openly benefit, at least take care of what you and I might call the least among us. Right? The people who really experience the most difficult lives, they're probably going to be treated very differently from behind a veil of ignorance than they would in a state of nature. And isn't that something? And Rawls, he says a lot of things in 900 pages. Most of them, many of them, are really silly. But boy, when he gets it right, he gets it really right. And he talks about the veil of ignorance and what have you. But then he also talks about the conditions under which people might be said to get legitimately wealthier. Notice you can get wealthier without it being legitimate. And I think most of us would agree with that. People would say, no, I don't agree with that. Well, sure you do. You wouldn't allow somebody to steal all the wealth. Right? There are legitimate ways to come to it and illegitimate ways. And Rawls puts a very fine point on it. He says, any increase in wealth is fine, as long as the least of us are benefited too. Not benefited as much, right? So the rich get richer and the poor get richer. The poor don't get richer to the same degree, but they do, in fact, get richer. And Rawls would say every time, as long as you can say the poor are getting richer, there is no justice problem here.
There's no justice problem at all.
No. As long as the poor are better off today than they were yesterday, you don't have a justice problem. I don't know. I think there's a problem there only because oligarchies emerge. And you could easily see a case in which the poor are very marginally benefited and the same group of rich people just get more and more powerful. And that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I'm thinking about child labor, for example. And it is clearly the case that, if you go to a lesser developed country where people are starving, and I mean starving literally, and you open up a factory and pay them pennies an hour to work, they'll be better off.
They're all better off.
Now, according to Rawls, that's perfectly legitimate. That's just. And yet it strikes, even me, a free market economist, it strikes me as a little bit odd. Now, I would make arguments about competition will push that up and blah, blah, blah. But from a justice perspective, it still bothers me a bit.
I don't know that it bothers me at all, but oligarchy sure does. And an oligarchy that'll be the thing that just does away with the American-style democracy that we've got.
Yeah, so we may be talking about the same sort of thing, because as I think about the problem, my concern is if you squelch competition so that guy who went and built the factory, forevermore he's paying them pennies an hour, and they don't have the ability to earn more because there is no competition for their labor. That's a problem, but that smells a lot like what you're describing. It's an oligarchic situation. In other words, they're imposing. Factory owner is using some form of coercion. Yes, he made them better off, but to prevent them from becoming any better still.
Well, yeah, it would seem like monopsony is lurking right below the surface of this line of reasoning that we've got, although it doesn't have to. You could end up in the same sort of position even if you don't technically have monopsony power.
So tell me more than what you have in mind when you talk about oligarchy.
Well, oligarchy is just the rule of the few. A small group of people over time gobbles up all the available political authority that they can find, and before you know it, it's illegitimate. I mean, the hilarious thing right now is that Bernie Sanders and AOC are wandering from city to city on their anti-oligarchy tour, not realizing that they're two oligarchs. Right?
Right.
How do you not see it? But apparently they just can't.
The same way that Bernie doesn't see that he's a millionaire.
Well, he does see that he's a millionaire, though, because he doesn't talk about the evil millionaires anymore.
Right. Right. The millionaires all of a sudden aren't evil.
That's not where your problem is. Your problem is those stinking billionaires. And, you know, I'm old enough to remember when Bernie Sanders said a lot of about millionaires right until he became one. And then again, I mean, I guess political hypocrisy is just going to be kind of like the Sesame Street word of the day, right? The letter of the day. Here we are. There's just no way around this foolishness, right? And Rawls offers us, I think, a very interesting way to think about these things. I don't want to live in a world in which I have to decide what justice looks like before I know what my own circumstances are. And that's just the point, isn't it? That none of us want to do that, which probably indicates exactly why we would have to.
And I would argue that the evidence that none of us want to do that is right before us, and it is the market for insurance. And there's all kinds of things going on around the edges, but generally speaking, what's happening with insurance is you are paying an amount of money to protect yourself against ending up in a bad situation in the future. It's very much like this veil of ignorance, wherein you can arrange matters so that if you end up in the poorhouse or in the bad situation, there's some protection for you.
The obvious difference is that in Rawls, a theory of justice, you know nothing about yourself. When you deal with insurance, clearly you do. What you don't know are the odd sort of things that will happen to you over time.
Yeah, and we're actually going to do a separate episode on insurance, and we'll go into all the details and so forth. I'm thinking perhaps take the example of catastrophic insurance, right? Something that most reasonable people would say, yeah, at a low enough price, no question, I'd buy that.
Yeah. I just don't think that the comparison is apt enough to do a lot of heavy lifting. When you say, look, you won't know anything about your own situation, that's a really different philosophical animal than anybody else has ever put forth. Mm-hmm. And you got to give it to Rawls as a result, right? This is a really good thought experiment. It's only a thought experiment, but it's a particularly good one, because most people, if they're honest, would admit that they're going to come up with a radically different understanding of what justice is under those circumstances than they would under a circumstance of perfect knowledge of their own reality.
Yeah, you don't get to hide behind the, well, I worked hard for it, therefore.
No, you don't. And look, what is fair? I mean, he has this thing, justice as fairness. Okay, I mean, we're splitting hairs by the time you get to that. But what does a fair system look like? And it turns out, unless you have an immediate answer as to why Rawls is wrong, it may take a lot more work to land on a just system than first appears to be the case.
Right.
You know, I don't know what more to say about that. It's that kind of interesting. It's a definitive statement that we're making.
Does Rawls propose an answer, or is he simply posing the question?
Oh, you don't write 900 pages without having an answer is something. Right? And, you know, the fact of the matter is that we all do know the reality of our own existence. We all know this. And the best you can do is make people aware of how that might be impacting their decision making. Right? You can't get them ever to say, well, this is thus just, and we will always do this. People will not do that. Human beings are deeply self-interested, and they will follow their own self-interest, and they will refer to that as justice every single time. We see it all the time.
I would imagine the closest we come to that is the about to be parent. I've seen so many examples of young men who were not antagonistic, but not that interested in issues of women's rights until they had daughters.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's fair. And even having a wife might do something, to how they view the world. But, by the time they get to a change of heart because they have daughters, that's self-interest.
Well, yeah, but I would say Rawls' thought experiment rests on self-interest to begin with.
No, it's in contradistinction to self-interest. It shows you how your own self-interest pollutes your political outlook.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because as I'm performing the thought experiment for myself, asking, what sort of government, I'm invoking my self-interest and saying, okay, if I'm born into a poor situation, this is the kind of government I'd want. But if I'm born into a rich situation, that's going to harm me in certain ways. So what's the optimal in between? It's my self-interest that's driving my answer.
Right. You want to maximize the good things that will happen. But honestly, you can't do that. You have to understand what you would say if you just had no idea where you fell.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, we're always asking about the same question, right? What do those who are, how best to put it, what do the most profoundly disabled among us, what do they deserve?
Mm-hmm.
There's the question that this always becomes. And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question in my life as I have it. I don't know the answer to that question under some sort of Rawlsian system. I just don't know. I've been thinking about it for 30 years, and I don't know.
Well, for his 900 pages, Rawls ends up not too far from the golden rule of treat others as you would have them treat you.
I think ultimately that's right. Ultimately that's right. It's sad. It's not particularly fascinating to come to that conclusion. Nonetheless, I think that's as close as you're going to get to a realistic summary. So what do we all do? I don't know. But it's interesting to think about it from this other direction, right? You get radically different answers when you force yourself, when you're alone, to think about it in this way. It may not be the answer you want to get. Or you may be arriving at an answer you have real distaste for. And yet, that might be indicative that your own politics are defective.
Right.
If you can look at a radically different perspective and say, yeah, under those circumstances, I might choose that. Well, then maybe you should choose that under all circumstances. Maybe you're the defect. And that's, I think, what made Rawls so important during his time, right? Because you could read it and say, well, yeah, I'm the problem.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.